So this is very true for me. If I haven't slept enough, I can get a migraine. Or when I'm stressed, then I can also, as a result, get a migraine, feeling anxious. Or when I'm stressed, then one builds on top of the other, and the result can be irritation, even rage. And with estrogen peaks, it's even worse. Estrogen really messes up my system, and then the histamine is very high, and then I feel anxious, irritated, antsy, restless. It's a very uncomfortable feeling. But now I have started to take the Diamine Oxydase supplement, and it's really a game changer. So when I feel a migraine coming on, usually it starts like a faint pain in my nose, of all places, or just sometimes on the side of my head, left or right, it depends. But very often it's facial pain. That's where it starts usually. So I know it's coming on, so I take a DAO supplement and it goes away. It's very fascinating. So there is no need for ibuprofen anymore. And that's really great. What a relief.
We got to start this with, what is histamine? Yeah, that's a good question, because a lot of people think histamine's a bad thing because you always hear the word antihistamine. And it's not. I mean, it's something we really need in our immune system. When our immune system senses some type of threat, it sends in chemicals like histamine, and it opens up our blood vessels and lets our blood vessels and lets our immune system come in and attack whatever pathogen is there. It's also really important with the production of hydrochloric acid, which we know is really important for things like SIBO and any type of bacterial overgrowth in the gut. And it's a messenger between the brain and the body, so it's super important. So it's definitely not a bad thing. We just don't want too much of it. Yeah.
So I started reading this book. It was recommended to me by a friend who also struggles with this. It's a little bit of an older book, 2013, but it has really great content. So I definitely have cold feet a lot, and also from time to time muscle cramps, but not so often anymore. And this is a thing of the past, luckily. Luckily, I also never had panic attacks. Must be horrible to experience that. Yeah, but sleep disturbances, yes, not being able to fall asleep or waking up in the middle of the night or too early after 4 hours of sleep. And this difficulty understanding fast speech, I think this is something that many autistics struggle with. So if somebody fires at you words, it's just gibberish. So I never had a headache after eating cold things, but I started coughing. Ice cream or cold drink didn't matter, but I always start coughing after it. So whenever I drink it room temperature or even warm. And that, yes, feeling tired from heat, definitely. In summer, I'm just only halfway functioning. And I used to have solar allergy on my index finger and thumb, but this has somehow stopped. And I think it's my way of eating, having a meat-based diet. That helps with those kinds of things.
Let's talk about histamine intolerance, because this is an issue that only, in recent years has really gotten the attention that it deserves. Yeah. And even still, there's a lot of people walking around who are not familiar with histamine intolerance. Yeah, so what happens is once that histamine comes in and does its job, it's supposed to be broken down by these enzymes. And certain people are lacking these enzymes, or they're low in the enzymes, and there's different reasons for that. And so histamine then starts to build up, and we have histamine receptors all over the body. So because we have histamine receptors all over the body, people get symptoms that are so random, kind of like thyroid. You have these symptoms all over that are random, that if you go to a doctor and you're like, I have this and this and this, it's very hard for them to piece it together, because they're kind of everywhere. So it's just an intolerance to the amount of histamine that's floating around in the body. Histamine intolerance, people are having intolerance to histamine, and inability to clear this chemical compound that their body makes naturally. How do those symptoms tend to show up for people? Really, so many different things. It can be, the biggest things I see are migraine, eczema or other, types of dermatitis, runny nose if you're eating and your nose is running.
I always used to get that from very spicy foods, and I no longer eat them anyway. But now, if the meat has high histamine, my nose will start running. And it's not spicy, it just has salt. And that's why I started freezing my meat. So as soon as I come home, I put the meat I have bought in the freezer and I leave it there, and I only take out what I need for the next day. And this has proven to be a great thing to do, and my nose is no longer running. It's very interesting. So, if you have histamine intolerance, freeze your meat. That really helps.
Probably are having an issue with that food. Flushing, hives. And I think, when I say hives, I'm very cautious of saying that, because people think if they don't have hives, they don't have histamine intolerance. Yeah, many people don't have hives that have histamine intolerance, but a lot of people do. And sometimes people get like a tightening of the throat, especially after eating something high in histamine. Anxiety is really, really tied to it. Increased heart rate, when you're eating, and if you've ever noticed your heart rate speeding up while you're eating, it's probably because you're eating a high histamine food and your body's not doing well with it. Diarrhea, it kind of, people will say, I just get random diarrhea. and it's usually histamine related. So those are kind of the biggest things I see. Yeah. So, and then I'm curious, you in your book, you go into, everything that we're talking about here. And where can people get your book, by the way? Amazon and really wherever books are sold.
This is the book she is talking about. I have read it, but at the end she has a lot of recipes in it, and they are all high oxalates, or most of them. So I wouldn't follow the recipes. And for me, it's clear anyway, I eat a meat-based diet. But for those who are on a paleo or ketogenic diet, be aware that many of those recipes I cannot recommend because they are high in oxalates. And this will mess up your body just the same.
Awesome. Yeah, so if you guys are interested, definitely check out her book. She has a whole book about what we're talking about right now. But let's chat a little bit about, what are some of the underlying causes of histamine intolerance? So we've talked about, and if you guys missed it, you're going to want to go back and watch this in the beginning. We talked about symptoms, what it can look like, and what histamine is. But why are some people having issues with histamine intolerance? So the biggest thing that I believe is the underlying cause is something called mast cell activation syndrome. It's what I have.
There is a book on that, mast cell activation syndrome, 542 pages, and it sounds like a thorough book. I haven't read it myself, but I will definitely order that one. This sounds really interesting. An in-depth overview of mast cell activation disease with a focus on mast cell activation syndrome. A patient story describing life with mast cell activation syndrome. And a practical guide. And this is also interesting, including Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, POTS, Lyme disease, because actually many autistics have EDS or POTS. So there is definitely also a connection between autism and mast cell activation syndrome or histamine intolerance, it seems.
It's where your body releases, so our mast cells are what releases the histamine. And, like I explained earlier, histamine is released with a threat to the immune system. But with mast cell activation syndrome, it's released without a threat to the immune system. There's little things that can set it off, like the smell of perfume. I mean, it's kind of like an abnormal release of histamine. So you're just kind of dumping histamine all the time.
Again, if you have a histamine intolerance, this is what your body can react to. So avoid alcoholic beverages, cheese, chocolate, cured sausages, also bacon, nuts, tomatoes, strawberries, other fruits, citrus fruits. Yeah, sauerkraut and spinach. Fish is okay if you eat it fresh or frozen, but not smoked. That's bad. I got a runny nose from salmon, smoked salmon, so I stopped eating that as well. And sauerkraut, spinach, it totally made me bloated. It was insane. Spinach is also very high in oxalates, by the way. Spinach is a very bad food. Don't eat that. Strangely, I never like the smell of apple, especially the artificial one.
And it's not really known exactly why people have mast cell activation syndrome, but it is typically runs in families, and you'll see like my mom has it, I have it. It's kind of like that. Yeah. There's anything tied to the gut. We all talk about the gut so much and how important it is to have good gut health. But if the bad bacteria that grows in the gut is actually histamine producing. And then that main enzyme that breaks down histamine, the DAO enzyme, is produced primarily, it's produced everywhere, but it's primarily produced in the gut. So if you have any type of gut infection, plus, you're creating more histamine, and then you're breaking down that enzyme that's helping you break down the histamine. It's kind of a double-edged sword with the gut. So the leaky gut bacteria, yeast overgrowth, parasites, any of that stuff going on in the gut. Different medications, even antihistamines, which people take for this issue, they can be temporarily okay, but the problem is that they are actually decreasing that DAO enzyme also.
I used to be a total chocolate addict. I have talked about this in another video. Yeah, and I had the worst premenstrual symptoms you can imagine. It's called PMDD. It was really, really bad, and I think weaning off of sugar, but also dairy, so stopping eating chocolate and cheese was in the end very beneficial, and my PMS was no longer so severe. When I started supplementing with fish oil, I could really feel a difference in terms of less anxiety and also very clear thinking. So possibly this fish oil was the cause for this.
So in the long run, they're kind of making this problem a lot worse. Yeah, and there's a lot of medications that do it. So many. I have a whole list in my book, but a lot of different medications.
This is really important to know. And this is the reason why I try to take as little ibuprofen as possible. I have never been a fan of aspirin, and it was useless for migraines, but unfortunately ibuprofen was my way to go when I had a migraine to be able to work. But now I instead work with DAO supplements, and this is much better. So I can really avoid taking ibuprofen from now on. And I just came across this information about paracetamol and ibuprofen in regards to empathy. Have a listen.
Change your personality, and we know ibuprofen and paracetamol can cause a reduction in empathy. So how does this kind of correlate to that? Nutrient deficiencies, inflammatory, anything inflammatory, any type of inflammatory disease, especially inflammatory bowel disease. Those as with inflammation is histamine, with histamine is inflammation.
So this was a great video on the Irish channel. Bart Kay talking about nutrition, and as always, it is spot on and excellent content. I will put the link in the description. And just saying that inflammation is caused by inflammatory foods, and meat is the least inflammatory. Many people heal their issues that they have suffered from for years and years by going on a meat-based carnivore diet, and their symptoms all but vanish. And there are many, many cases like this, myself included, Bart Kay as well.
What kind of diet, what kind of food should we be putting in our mouths, and why?
Okay, so all of this is caveated with, this is my opinion based on my not insignificant understanding of the physiology and science. What it seems to me that the optimal diet for human beings is a diet that is almost entirely devoid of any form of plant matter at all. It's usually just referred to as the carnivore diet, because basically everything that goes in an ideal situation, if you're adherent to the diet, all of it is animal-based food. So it's based around the muscle meats of the ruminants, cows mostly. There are occasional poultry and fish and other things, other seafoods and things that come into it, but the basis of the diet is steak and mince, really, with the associated fat that comes along with that, and usually with some additional fat in the form of usually butter or lard or something like that. Basically, it's almost like it's the exact reverse of the diet that the health authorities are telling us that we should be eating. The health authorities have got this badly wrong, Niall, in my opinion, based on my many years of study in the area. I have been a research scientist. I have published a number of articles myself as well, so it's not like I'm just kind of reading the literature and going, here's my opinion. I've actually been involved in developing the literature as well. So it's not just some crazy opinion. It sounds crazy to a lot of people the first time they hear it. They go, what do you mean you don't eat plants, for goodness sake? Vitamin C, they say, and fiber. Where do you get your fiber from? And all of this kind of stuff. It turns out that the bill of goods that we've been sold about what humans need in their diet on a daily basis, absolutely unsupported by science, and in fact, it doesn't make sense physiologically. If you want me to kind of put some kind of sense to this so that people can think, well, okay, maybe this is not just some crazy idea, is if the diet that was being suggested to us was good for us, then public health statistics would be favourable, wouldn't they, Niall?
They would, absolutely. Now, a lot of people in my...
They're not, are they?
No, they're not, no.
They're not. The public health statistics are appalling. And it's not because people are not adhering to the diet that are being suggested to them. They are.
Yeah, a lot of my listeners are very sceptical of the government and things the government says, but when it comes to diet, for some reason, when I try to convince them that plants are possibly toxic. They can't understand that. I don't know, like, and people in the live chat are saying, how dare this man say don't eat potatoes? we're all Irish.
Look, listen, I want to be really clear, people. I'm not telling anybody what to do. I actually, I'm at great pains on my channel and here right now as well to say, look, I am not actually advocating a diet. I'm not saying you should do this to anybody. I'm saying, if we look at what the science tells us about human beings in terms of how they're designed, how their organ systems work, the physiology, all this kind of stuff, it all points in the direction of humans, for the vast majority of our entire existence on this planet, having eaten almost entirely animals, with a few bits of plant matter thrown in here and there. It's only in the last, we're told, 5,000 years that humans have really seriously built cities, developed big agriculture and all that kind of stuff, and switched to a largely plant-based diet instead of the traditional animal-based diet. And when we think about each and every one of ourselves as individuals, you'd have to accept and admit straight away that ever since you could understand, your parents, the authorities, the government, all of these organisations have told you from that time, get 5+ a day fruit and vegetables. Make sure you keep your fibre up. You've got to have vitamin C in your diet. Avoid saturated fat because that'll give you heart disease and kill you. Avoid animal protein because you'll get cancer from that, especially red meat and processed meat. And all these messages that you've heard thousands and thousands and thousands of times in your life, and no one's ever questioned it. It becomes an indoctrination. It becomes a form of brainwashing. And I'm a bit up against it because I'm the guy who's standing up and saying, hang on a minute. All this settled science that you're claiming you've got, you scientists, look, I'm a scientist. You know, I'm in the club. I've been there, I've done that. I've been a peer reviewer myself for academic journals, as in the guy who decides whether someone's paper is good enough for publication or not. So, you know, I've got some idea about science, and I'm sitting here and I'm saying it looks like people are supposed, by design, people are supposed to eat animals.
Good man.
Yeah, those are probably the biggest things, you know, hormone imbalances like estrogen dominance. You know, estrogen really drives your body to release more histamine. Same with thyroid issues, and it can go both ways. It can be hypothyroidism, it can be hyperthyroidism. They both work a little bit differently in how it makes your body release more histamine, but, you know, hormone issues definitely play a big role. Yeah, and that's, you know, part of why even cyclical migraines can be difficult for some people because, you know, if you're only focused on, okay, well, maybe it's excess estrogen, you could be missing the histamine component. Right. And as you said, there's some people who are genetically predisposed to have this issue, and that could be at the root of what's going on with migraines, with estrogen just tipping the scale every single month. Yes, exactly. I used to get every single month, I would get a migraine, and it would last for about 3 days right before my period.
Yep.
And I didn't have necessarily estrogen dominance, but my estrogen, because I had this predisposition for this, when my estrogen would go up right before, you know, ovulation or right before my period, I would get these migraines. And that's what happens so much. I see it every day when I talk to people. Whether it be pharmaceuticals or natural therapies, that there are outliers. There are people who have paradoxical reactions, and that's to be expected. So as much as, like, you know, they can read your book, or we can talk about how, like, you know, like nettles can be super great for some people, but it may not be true for you. And that's why it's so important to partner with a doctor when you're trying to navigate all of this. Yeah, it's so true because everyone is so different. And I am the biggest person you'll hear say there is no one thing for everybody. And even with histamine intolerance. And that's why in my book I give a yes, no, and maybe list. Because the maybe foods are foods that you should tolerate, but I see people don't tolerate them sometimes. So I have that people keep a really good track of what they're eating, what it's doing, and, you know, focus on those lists and kind of come up with a plan for them that makes their body work.
In Western Europe, say for example Ireland, people have this idea that we were eating lots of vegetables. What, like, aren't most if not all vegetables now hybrids, like broccoli and all these root vegetables? They didn't exist in their existing form as they did now. Can you explain to us, like 1,000 years ago, what was the Irish diet or Western Europe or Europeans diet?
Right, so I'm really not an expert on the history of Ireland at all, but my understanding, what I was taught, be it right or wrong, I don't actually know, Niall, but I was told that the traditional diet of the Irish people is a meat, potatoes and veg type of diet, where potatoes very, very important, an absolute staple. Of course, we learned all about the famines, etc. in school when I was a lad.
But potatoes were introduced into Ireland only a couple of hundred years ago, Bart.
Well, there you go. So, you know, I have no idea about Irish history, as I say, other than, you know, traditionally I was told the Irish diet was potato based. It doesn't surprise me that potatoes were introduced there. I mean, you tell me, what were Irish people eating?
In my opinion, all these, like, potatoes were introduced from South America, I think Peru. The only, like, what root vegetables were available? I don't think hardly any root vegetables were available 1,000 years ago. The only thing we had to eat was meat, animals. Like, what was available? I don't think anything was available. Maybe fruit for 1 month.
Oh,
you know?
Exactly, yeah, so the fruit would have been available for a month or so just as the autumn begins. That's when most fruit becomes ripe. There might have been scratching around for roots and tubers and things in times of real famine and real strife, but it would seem to me that it was a society probably where animals were kept and, you know, animals were the source of food. I presume dairy as well. That's the kind of, and when you look at some actual science, like there are anthropologists running around saying, look, we found these tools, we found this and that, we found fossilized feces with fiber in them, you know, and all of this kind of stuff, and saying, you know, this is what points to people having eaten plants and all this kind of stuff. But you go to a thing like N15, nitrogen 15 isotope testing, which is a form of scanning where you can take tissue from the skeletal remains of human beings that have existed or that lived at any time in our, what we're told is our evolutionary history. And we scan those bones, and the level of nitrogen 15 to nitrogen 14, the ratio of those two isotopes of nitrogen in those bones, tells us without any question. It answers, it's a slam dunk. It tells us what people ate. And it was meat. It was the flesh of animals with very small amounts of plant matter, probably thrown in as either subsistence material or for medicinal purposes. And that seems to be what human beings have eaten. Slam dunk. Never mind looking at fossilized feces that have got some fiber in them. Well, of course, you know, someone's leavings that have got fiber in is going to last longer than someone else's that doesn't have fiber in it, because the fiber is going to bind it together. It's more likely to stick together. Fiber doesn't break down as quickly as fat and protein does under bacterial action. So, of course, you know, when you find fossilized human feces, well, look, fiber.
Speaking of fiber,
but let's do some actual science.
Speaking of fiber, Bart, the so-called scientists and the government are telling us that we need fiber in our diet for gut microbiome. Is that the case, or is there any science telling us that we don't need fiber in our diet, and are we better off without fiber in our diet?
Okay, so as I sort of said right at the start, the state of science in human nutrition is very poor. There are very, very few properly controlled lock-in experimental metabolic ward studies that have been done. And in the case of when you're talking about fiber, there is one study that exists in the literature. And that is a study where they took 84, I believe it was, individuals who were constipated at the outset of the study. So these are people who are already constipated. They took these people and they locked them in a metabolic ward for a set period of time, and they removed different percentages of the fiber from their diets in sort of a random order, crossover stylely. And what they found was that there was a reduction in all the signs and symptoms of the constipation, which was dose dependent, and the reduction in symptoms followed the reduction in fiber, to the point where those subjects who had all the fiber removed from their diet, 100% withdrawal of fiber, all of those 84 participants experienced complete 100% remission of all signs and symptoms of their chronic constipation.
Yep.
That's the only actual experimental study we've got about fiber. N equals 84 subjects is not a statistically powerful study, probably. You need more people to be reasonably decently sure about the outcome, that it didn't happen purely due to dumb chance. But when you've got something as marked as that, 100% remission in every single individual, that's pretty convincing to me.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about some of the foods that are highest in histamine, because I think it really illustrates this point well, because some of these foods that are high in histamine are really nutrient dense foods. Yes. However, they might not work for you. Yeah. So it's crazy because, you know, with keto and with paleo, there's a lot of high histamine foods, and people go on these diets, which I think are great diets, don't get me wrong, for certain people. But, you know, then they were starting to eat fermented foods and a lot of avocados and bacon and stuff, and all of that stuff is high in histamine. Mm-hmm. So it's, you know, shocking to people. If I ever hear someone say I did keto and I started feeling really sick, and then their responses are these histamine responses, I'm like, yeah, because you have histamine intolerance. So, so avocados, which we all love, it's like the worst thing. Don't have to give up if you do have to give those up. Fermented foods, you know, fermented foods do grow, you know, histamine producing bacteria. You know, meat is okay as long as it's, you know, organic and no hormones and all that, but it has to be fresh. You know, you have to, if you get your meat, you have to freeze it immediately, and you can't just leave it sitting out in the refrigerator for a couple of days and then cook it and then put it back and eat leftovers and stuff, because the longer food is cooked or is out in general, like let's say you're leaving meat out in the refrigerator, more histamine producing bacteria is growing. And that's why I rinse my meat, and I talk about rinsing my meat, because you can actually get a lot of that bacteria off. But the thing with histamine on food is you can't cook it out. So you can't, you know, you can cook a lot of things out of food. You can't cook histamine out, but you can freeze it and make it stop growing. So that's really, really important. I go over that a lot on my Instagram and in my book, you know, exactly how to kind of meal prep, because it's tough. It's tough to have to make everything fresh all the time. Certain nuts, you know, cashews, walnuts, they're both pretty high in histamine. Citrus fruit is high, but sometimes people will do really well with lemons, and then they can't do limes or oranges. So it's you have to kind of play with that and see how you are affected. Spinach,